Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, February 7th, 2020, and it looks like we're not even done with the Iowa caucus yet. With the New Hampshire primary coming up in just a couple of days, it is very critical that we take a look at how well polling data actually matched up to the actual results and analyzing the actual data that proved to be correct on Election Day. RCP currently shows Joe Biden in fourth place, followed by Elizabeth Warren in third place, then Pete Buttigieg in second place, and then with Bernie Sanders on top with 3.5% of a lead compared to the RCP average of 3.7%. Based off that alone, I would say that the numbers are pretty accurate. However, when you take a look at the state delegates, which actually impact the Iowa caucus and who gets the national delegates, it goes Pete Buttigieg with 13 delegates, Bernie Sanders with 12, Elizabeth Warren with 8, Joe Biden with 6, and Amy Klobuchar with 1, and the rest of the candidates have yet to get a singular delegate. Now, first of all, the reason why the delegates are so important is because you need at least one delegate to qualify for the next debate. I guess actually no. So since the debate is going on today, the next debate is the one that you need a delegate to qualify for, and it looks like Amy Klobuchar will be joining the rest of the four on that debate stage, and it doesn't look like many other candidates are going to end up polling too well in certain individual states, which are another way to qualify, so they may not end up being on that debate stage. However, let's take a look at the poll that actually proved to be the most accurate in terms of statewide results. It showed Pete Buttigieg in a victory, followed by Bernie Sanders, and then a tie between Warren and Biden, even though in the actual election, Warren overcame Joe Biden by a small amount. This is a very interesting poll, mainly because it reflected what the state delegates actually came up with as their quote-unquote final result. It did not reflect the statewide first round voting order, but it did prove to be pretty significant in terms of the data that actually impacted who got what delegates. So pretty much, let's just take a look from the top. So final results, Iowa Democratic Caucuser Survey. David Binder Research, it had a D by the name, so it likely was sponsored by the Democratic Party or an insider poll. Obviously, I mean, it's a Democratic caucus, but pretty much it started off with which political party are you registered, Democrat or Independent, how interested you are in the Iowa caucus. Keep in mind, there were only about 6,000 more votes in this Iowa caucus than in 2016, so turnout didn't exactly skyrocket by any means. But pretty much, let's just keep looking. All of that is just whether or not you're participating. Taking a look at the approval rating, well, obviously the person with the lowest approval rating is President Donald Trump, followed by Michael Bloomberg, and then it goes to Andrew Yang, possibly because people don't know who that is, Tom Steyer, and then we actually hit a lot of the top named candidates. Joe Biden has a 62% approval rating in Iowa. Then it goes up to Amy Klobuchar at 63, Bernie Sanders at 64, Elizabeth Warren at 68, and Mayor Pete Buttigieg at 69. So that is a very interesting, I guess, look at the way that these Democratic candidates ranked these voters in terms of how well they actually liked them. Not many of them had too much of an unfavorability rating, which actually spells out good news for party unity in the long run. So let's take a look at where these people said they were certain that they were voting for certain or leaning in favor of each candidate. It looks like the person with the most certain votes is Pete Buttigieg at 17%, then Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, then Joe Biden. Again, a pretty accurate reflection of what we saw in the actual election, then followed by Amy Klobuchar, and I believe the next person there might have been Andrew Yang or Tulsi Gabbard. So that is something to take a look at. The fact that that actually accurately reflected the state delegate counts. I think that's always interesting when the data matches the way that the caucus system works, but not exactly the final vote in terms of the second round or even the first round. But it definitely goes to tell us something that this poll was pretty correct. And I actually want to see how these certain people wanted to say about party unity and all issues pertaining to that. So how certain are you of your choice? About half of them were 100% certain. The rest of them were pretty much up to consideration, but many of them had already made their minds up. And on caucus night, if your first choice candidate is not viable or receiving support from at least 15% of those present, which is more likely, I will caucus for a different group. I will leave the caucus site, or I will leave the uncommitted group. Well, it ended up being 70% joining for a different candidate. The reason why some of these candidates may not have performed too well is because you did need that 15% in a certain area for you to even be viable, and candidates, big name candidates, even like Joe Biden, didn't end up being viable on election night, which was detrimental to their campaign as a whole. If you caucus for another candidate, which other candidate would you be more likely in your first choice is not viable by receiving at least 15% of support of those present? Pretty much it moves over to Joe Biden and Amy Klobuchar, Elizabeth Warren. Bernie Sanders actually is lower than all three of them, which is pretty interesting. Pete Buttigieg at 10%. So it looks like a lot of the people that already were voting for Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg already had their minds made up. But if they were not certain, they would actually stagger down to Warren, Biden, Klobuchar, which actually could have been interesting if those were the actual results. If you chose a nomination between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, who would win? Joe Biden wins over Bernie Sanders by 6%. It's not exactly the biggest margin, but it definitely goes to show something that a lot of these other supporters may actually be more in favor of supporting Joe Biden over Bernie Sanders. But then again, it's a 5-point something margin of error with a 6-point margin. So maybe narrow victory for Joe Biden at the worst case for him, but definitely is something to take a look at. They also have national polls between the two, so those are also pretty interesting. Who has the best chance at beating Donald Trump? Pretty standard question. Always ends up with Joe Biden being on top, Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, and then the rest. So not actually much to see there, but that's just the general results that we see nationwide. Only 11%, actually, that's a pretty large amount. 1 in 10 Democrats from Iowa said that if their candidate is not nominated, they will vote for Donald Trump in November. That's not necessarily the best sign. You really don't want to be seeing numbers like that if you're the Democratic Party chair. But taking a look at those who might vote for a third-party candidate, I mean, that's same thing. 1 in 10 Democrats and 1 in 5 Democrats are heavily considering voting for a third-party candidate. I mean, they didn't even completely rule it out, and not many people are going to end up staying home. A lot of people want to do their civic duty and voting, but that's pretty much it. So if you take a look at the age distribution, there aren't a lot of young voters polled, which I genuinely think is pretty interesting. Caucus goers are typically younger voters because they can afford to be at those caucus sites for a lot longer than older voters, which is exactly why there's a case against caucuses and for primaries, because they're considered undemocratic for that reason alone. However, there's a whole number of pros and cons for having a caucus or even a primary itself. So those definitely need to be reviewed if they actually have concerns about caucuses by the DNC itself, because they're the ones who hold this. Iowa does not hold the caucus. So if you went to the Iowa Secretary of State website, like I did, and didn't realize that the Democratic Party ran it, well, I mean, I kind of knew that, but I thought that they would at least have some results. They do not. But education doesn't actually impact much. Same thing. Race, 93% white, which explains why Pete Buttigieg did so well. I mean, there were barely any African-American voters. I mean, 2%. That's 1 out of 50 people. And it looks like most of the voters that were here, not most, the plurality of voters that were here were moderates. So that definitely goes to show something as to a little bit surprising that Joe Biden didn't do as well, but it also makes sense why Pete Buttigieg did a little bit better. Progressive voters obviously are probably going to split right down the middle between Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. Liberals are probably going to end up over in that column. But moderate and conservative voters that are on the Democratic side are likely going to end up voting for Pete Buttigieg or Joe Biden. And if you take a look at the overall first results, I mean, the polling results were pretty accurate. Bernie Sanders actually won in this election by 0.2 less than the RCP average. Yes, Biden did not do as well, and Buttigieg and Warren definitely did a lot better than expected, but also the general spread was correct. So I am very interested moving on to New Hampshire to see what we're going to end up seeing as the final results. Is it going to be a Sanders 4.3 margin, 4.7, 9, 1? You never know. But I think that looking at New Hampshire will also be pretty interesting. So I actually want to do this for every single primary or right after Super Tuesday. Just compare the results and find the most accurate poll and show it and just see what data came from it as well, because that could be also an accurate indication of how the state itself would vote, because they did correctly predict the results for a certain caucus or primary. New Hampshire, I do think that Joe Biden is going to end up in 4th place yet again, but he's really going to need to come back in Nevada and South Carolina, which may not actually happen if you take a look at recent polling data. South Carolina especially, I mean, this is Joe Biden's supposedly territory, but he isn't exactly leading by the largest of margins. Based off of a recent poll from Post and Courier. East Carolina University came out with a poll showing Biden ahead by 18%, but he better hope that that ends up being the result. And for Nevada, I mean, there haven't been any polls in forever. It literally just been a plateau for a really long time. So it should be pretty interesting taking a look at the Nevada results, especially after we hit Iowa. But New Hampshire is in just a couple of days. We're going to end up seeing New Hampshire in about 4 days. So make sure to tune in for that one. I expect results that night. Hopefully, I expect Bernie Sanders to be the victor, but I will update you after I do a little bit more in-depth analysis into this race and compare it to the trends that we saw in Iowa. So thank you guys for watching this video. Comment down suggestions below, and I will see you all tomorrow.